My name's Charity Rowland, and I'm a professor at the Institute on Development and Disability at Oregon Health and Science University, which is in Portland, Oregon. And my work there is strictly grants-based and strictly research-driven. And I've had a number of grants from the U.S. Department of Education over the years, and most of them have focused on communication development in children and adults with severe and multiple disabilities. Many of them have focused on children who are labeled deaf-blind. So when I started looking for graduate programs, I was looking for the most interesting research that was going on at the time, and to my mind, the research that was most appealing was the research that involved trying to teach human languages to non-human primates, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. And the program that I entered was that at the University of Oklahoma, where Roger Fouts had brought the chimpanzee named Washoe, who had been the subject of many sign language studies. And so at the university, I and the current batch of graduate students, we were called the Chimp People. We would go out to the farm where the chimps lived, and we would take them out of cages and we'd put them in a rowboat and row them across a little tiny body of water to a tiny island, and we would sit down with them and teach sign language. So that was very interesting research, but having a brother with severe disabilities, what was most compelling about it was the possibility that that would teach us something about human language acquisition in cases where language wasn't being acquired spontaneously. And that actually was the purpose of that research. It was funded to constitute an animal model for the development of human languages. So after a couple of years of working directly with the chimps, I shifted my focus to working with children with severe disabilities and looking at why they weren't acquiring speech and how we might remedy that. And I think that what we learned that was so important from working with these non-human primates was to focus on the fact that they were very good communicators without any speech, that they had a great gestural and vocal repertoire that was working just fine for them. They really didn't need our language to communicate. They had a very good means of communication, and I think that opened our minds to listening and observing non-speech modes of communication. My dissertation research involved following a group of children who were born blind, completely blind, in Oklahoma, and I would go around to their homes every few weeks and make videotapes of them interacting with their mothers. And so I spent a huge amount of time analyzing those videotapes to see exactly what was going on and how they were communicating with each other in, a fairly precise and routine way, in means that did not include speech for the most part, because these were children who were not only blind but had additional disabilities. So that also sensitized me to the ways that people can communicate without speech. So when I got my first job and started doing research in public schools and homes that involved children with severe disabilities, one of the things that I was focusing on was, what are these children doing to communicate? Because as their family members know, there's lots of communication going on in most instances. And people at that point, again, this was a long time ago, really weren't thinking about how communication happens even when there isn't speech. One of the things that became apparent very soon as I worked more and more with these children was that there was not a good assessment available that would capture the communication skills that were there. And so I started working on an assessment of my own to fill that gap that would do several things. I wanted it to tell us what children can do as opposed to all the many things they can't do. And I wanted it to point us to, given whatever means they're using to communicate, what are they able to do with it? What is its purpose? Because communication has a purpose, and you can have communicative behavior. So you could have somebody making a gesture or even saying a word or making something that looks like a manual sign, but if it's not produced with clear purpose and intent, then it's really not functioning as communication. So that was how I initiated my work on the communication matrix. So the matrix has evolved since the very first version of it, which I think was 1990. And I see it now as not just an assessment, but a way to point yourself towards the most appropriate intervention. And by that I mean basing intervention on present levels of functioning and successful functioning as opposed to hoped for levels of functioning. When you're first getting to know a child who is deaf-blind, I think the most important thing is going to be to observe that child in their natural contexts. You know, when you are looking at physiological responses, say you want to look at what's inside the body and you want to do an x-ray, or you want to do a CAT scan and look at what's happening in their stomach or their brain, or you want a blood test, yes, you can take the child to a clinic, because what you're looking at is not going to change by virtue of being in a clinic. But when you're looking at behavior of any sort, and especially communication, communication is totally dependent on the context and how the child feels and responds to the context. So you're going to want to watch them at home and in their familiar environments, whether it's daycare or at grandma's or in school. And you're going to want to just sort of discard any assumptions you have about how children are supposed to be communicating, and just go with what you see and your gut feelings about what you're seeing and what the child may be trying to communicate. I sort of think of it as when I'm in a situation where English isn't spoken, I sort of have this physical sense of disengaging my mind so that I'm not frantically trying to catch on to English words. I'm just opening myself to other patterns and just listening, hoping that some patterns will make themselves clear so I can understand what's going on. And I think you'll do something similar to that. You'll just open yourself up to what's happening, and you'll observe the child with familiar partners, and then maybe you'll step in and start engaging the child, and you'll get a sense of what the child is doing to communicate on whatever level that happens to be. When you have a child who is at the very earliest stages of communication, one of the puzzles you've got to solve may be whether their behavior is intentional or not. And so the matrix goes way down to the pre-intentional level where the child doesn't even have control over any motor behaviors, much less specific communication behaviors. So the matrix is going back to the very beginning, and it's essential that you sort through what is intentional communication or behavior and what isn't, because you may make some poor assumptions in terms of intervention if you make the wrong call there. So when you have a child whose behavior is difficult to read, perhaps only the family members really think that they know what that child wants. You need to look very carefully at their behavior. You might look at what they do when something that you know is unpleasant happens. How do they react to that? If there's something that any child would want, maybe a cuddle or some certain food or music, whatever, what does the child do when you provide that kind of stimulation? And so that gives you an idea of the behaviors that are there that give you a clue as to how that child feels, how they react to things. And then you want to take the next step and say, okay, can we harness those behaviors that are used to react to things and turn them into intentional communication? So the communicative behaviors come first, and they tell me something about what the child wants, and then I respond. So you do need to be careful about observing the child under perhaps some structured situations to try to figure out if that behavior is intentional. Is it directed to other people or not? Could it just as well be directed to the wall as to the presence of another person? Does the behavior stop when you're providing the thing that you think they want? Does the behavior stop because they don't need it anymore? Or if they produce some behavior and you don't respond to it, do they try some other behavior? Those sorts of things are signals that the behavior is intentional and that it would serve as a good intentional communicative behavior. You know, there's really no prerequisite to communication intervention. So even at that very first stage where there may be no intentional behavior or you can't tell whether there is or not, you're going to be intervening to try to improve communication and try to work your way towards some intentional behavior. I think Pat Miranda said, there's nobody who can't communicate as long as they can breathe, but even that is not a prerequisite because we have plenty of people who can't breathe by themselves, but they can communicate. So we want at that very earliest level where you don't even know if behavior is intentional, what you're going to do is be incredibly responsive to any sorts of movements or sounds or facial expressions. And you're going to provide consistent and speedy responses to any behavior that might possibly be under the child's control. And the hope is that eventually they will figure out that I do this one thing that I am in control of, this one movement or sound or facial expression that I can make when I want to. And lo and behold, mom or dad or my intervener responds in this great way, and that's just what I want, and so I'll do it more and more often. The very earliest behaviors that you're probably going to be targeting are going to be rejecting things that you don't want and requesting things that you do want. The requesting is the big one that people typically start with, partly because that harnesses intrinsic motivation. So you want to, at the early stages, when you have a child who should have learned to communicate intentionally and for many different reasons they haven't, motivation is going to be absolutely key, because why would they bother to learn this new behavior unless it's going to get them immediately something that they want? They've had so many disappointments along the way. They may have developed a sense of helplessness because nothing they do gets them what they want. So you're going to want to be systematic, and you're going to want to be able to write down what you're doing as you are engaged in some sort of instructional communicative activity. It may look like a very natural give and take, which is what it should look like. But in your head, you know, I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to show that child what I want. I'm going to show that child what the possibilities are. This is what I'm going to expect the child to do. If the child doesn't do it, this is the kind of support I'm going to give them. When they do it, this is how I'm going to reward them, and you're going to reward them by giving them exactly what they want, that they just requested, or by taking away something that they just said they don't like. You're not going to give them M&Ms when what they said was, I want something else. And you're going to also, occasionally, somebody's going to be taking some data so that you have the documentation that this child is really learning. I do think that it is always the time to provide symbolic input to children. So you talk to them whether they can hear speech or not, whether they can understand speech or not. you can provide some alternative symbol systems, such as three-dimensional objects to represent various activities in the day, or pictures if they can see them, manual signs if they can see them. That's great, and you're giving them all that experience, and maybe they will catch on spontaneously and at some point start using those symbols to communicate to you. And once you have those routines established, then it's a relatively easy task to then provide them a symbol that they use, perhaps instead of the gesture that they've been using in that routine. Then it becomes a natural part of the routine, and the likelihood of them catching on to what the symbol means is so much greater. So if you have a routine, for instance, where the child has learned to touch a choice from maybe 3 objects to say, this is the one I want, and now that routine is just second nature, and what you're going to do is instead give them a choice of 3 symbols of some sort that they have the capacity to understand. Maybe they don't right now, but as they start using them, they will understand what they mean. Then it's not a big leap for them to learn to touch a symbol and then be given the object that the symbol represents. That isn't a big leap at all, and that's how we want to construct these learning routines, so that learning is easy. And if learning isn't easy, if it doesn't come relatively quickly, then you know that something needs to be changed. It's not the child. The child doesn't have to change. There's something in the instructional situation that is not working for that child, and you need to look at all the many variables that go into that routine and figure out which ones you want to change, and then you'll change them systematically and sit back for a little bit, not long, and see if that made a difference. And so you'll keep making changes, either because the routine isn't working, learning isn't occurring, so we've got to make this routine easier for that child, or the child is learning. That's fantastic, but let's not rest on our laurels, because we want them to go as far as they can, as fast as they can. So we'll keep changing things up and upping the ante so they'll learn more. One of the things that I've learned over the years is to never have any preconceived notions about how far this child is going to go in terms of communication. So I'm not saying that every child is going to eventually start speaking or using Braille, but there is really no way to tell at the beginning how far they're going to go, and you don't want to lose hope, because if you employ a really systematic instructional strategy with baby steps along the way that the child is very likely to achieve very quickly, it is surprising how you can move from gestural communication to using perhaps 3-dimensional symbols that have an immediate meaning to the child, then perhaps backing off to more abstract symbols, like if they have enough vision, perhaps some 2-dimensional symbols, and maybe then eventually those could be presented on an iPad, and maybe eventually there could be some sort of abstract symbol system. Now you've got a concrete symbol system. You can understand perhaps pictures, or perhaps 3-dimensional symbols, or manual signs, hand-in-hand signs. Maybe you can get from that symbol system to some sort of written system, maybe a Braille system, because you have an existing, more concrete symbol system that you can link the abstract symbol system to. And I think that's really key. The position of the educational assistant or the intervener is so key to the instruction of these children. Typically, these are the people who are there minute to minute, day to day, helping this child learn to communicate. And in all of my research projects where we were working with children in the schools, it was educational assistants who were doing the daily instruction that we were recording and analyzing and changing up to encourage progress. So it's absolutely key that in the assessment process, for instance, these people Ideally, we'll do some assessment such as the communication matrix. Whatever is the appropriate assessment, they have to be involved. And as you're coming up with the motivating situations that you're going to build your communication routines around, these are the guys these are going to be the go-to guys. And in terms of the gut feeling of, is this working or not, boy, you got to listen to these people. Your opinion is really important. You know, if as an intervener you feel that your voice and instincts aren't being heard, one natural way to try to deal with that is to provide some data. Often that's not your job, but you may know in your heart that this is working or not working for this child, that this is real intentional communication or not. And there should be some way that you can demonstrate that objectively. So if you can think of specific behaviors and perhaps things that you do that seem to cause these behaviors and things that you do that don't cause any obvious response, if you can note those things down and maybe just for a day get some data on frequency of behaviors and frequency of responses and non-responses, that kind of thing may be a way to provide people who are perhaps skeptical with some real information. The communication matrix was developed specifically to provide a way for parents to easily volunteer their information about what their child does to communicate on an equal footing with that of the professionals. So using the same terminology, what do you see at home, what do you see in the community, which may be different from what the professionals see at school or in some clinic. And that difference is not bad, that difference is good, because that's a foundation for discussion and for revealing, oh, as most children do, they behave differently in different contexts, and you want that. That's a good thing. We also developed some time ago on one of our research projects that was funded by the government, something called Home Talk, which was a way to encourage parents to put down information not just about communication, but about all sorts of other ways that their child is developing, so that they can put their information in a cohesive, structured, organized way and provide that to professionals so that as they work together to develop educational goals, they have a clear recording of their instincts and knowledge about their child. The whole team is absolutely critical to the development of communication in any child, and particularly we want to make sure that the parents, caregivers, family members have an equal say to the say of the professionals involved with the children.